I was hiding in the back seat of my mother's silver SUV when she told me we were going for a drive. That was the word she used, drive, the way she always said things that meant something else entirely. I was 7 years old, but I already understood the language of almost truths. I already knew that when my mother's voice went smooth and flat like ironed silk, something was about to happen that she didn't want anyone to see. So I tucked myself low behind the passenger seat, behind the tower of grocery bags she always kept back there, and I watched through the gap. Rover was in the trunk. That was our German Shepherd, my father Walker's dog, the one he'd raised from a skinny, shivering pup he'd found at a rest stop 3 years before I was born. She was golden brown and black, enormous and gentle, with ears that stood at attention like small sentinels when you called her name. She had given birth 9 days earlier to 2 fat, squirming puppies that my father had named Bolt and Bean. He'd sat up the entire first night with a flashlight, just watching them breathe. I loved those puppies the way only a lonely child can love something small and helpless that loves her back without condition. My mother had not named them anything. The SUV turned off the main road without signaling. I felt the gravel crunch under the tires before I heard it, and we rolled slowly into the shadow of the tree line. The forest here was dense and old, the kind of dark that swallows sound. My mother cut the engine. For a moment, there was only the ticking of the cooling metal and the faint, low whine of Rover shifting in the trunk. I pressed myself smaller. My mother stepped out in her heels. That is the image I will carry for the rest of my life, those heels on that gravel. Tan suede stilettos against a dirt road, each step picking deliberately around the mud puddles, a heavy logging chain draped over one forearm like a designer handbag. Her blazer was cream-colored. She moved without hurry, without hesitation, the way she moved through every room she decided to enter, like the space owed her something. She opened the trunk. I could not see Rover from where I was crouched, but I heard her, the scramble of nails on metal, the confused, hopeful sound she made whenever she thought she was being let out for a walk. A sound I recognized, a sound that twisted something in my chest. "Move," my mother said quietly to no one. There was a short, rough scuffle, then the slam of the trunk. I rose up, just enough to see over the seat. Rover was pressed against the base of a pine tree, her ears flat, her dark eyes scanning the tree line as if searching for something familiar. My mother was looping the chain around the trunk with quick, practiced movements, threading it through Rover's collar with the efficiency of someone completing a task on a checklist. Bolt and Bean had been placed on the ground. I hadn't even seen her do it, and they were crawling blindly toward their mother's warmth, making the small, frantic sounds of creatures too young to understand why the world had suddenly gone cold and strange. Rover didn't bark, she didn't lunge. She simply looked at my mother with those amber eyes, her whole body trembling, and I think that was the worst part. She trusted her. Even then, even as the chain pulled taut and my mother stepped back, Rover's tail made one small, uncertain sweep, as if she was still waiting for this to be something else. My mother walked back to the SUV, brushing her hands together once. Clean. She didn't look back. The engine started. The tires pulled forward, and I sat in the back seat, frozen, watching through the rear window as the pine tree shrank smaller and smaller, and Rover watched us go, and the 2 tiny puppies pressed into her side, and the sky above the tree line was the color of a bruise. We were back on the main road before I exhaled. My mother dropped me at home with a bright, practiced smile and said she had errands to run. She kissed my forehead. Her perfume was the same as always, something expensive and floral that I have never been able to smell since without my stomach tightening. I stood on the front porch and watched her reverse out of the driveway. Then I turned around and started walking back toward the forest. I didn't think about it the way an adult thinks about something, weighing it, finding reasons, talking myself into it. I simply knew where my feet needed to go. The sky was already thickening, the light going flat and gray the way it does before the temperature drops, and somewhere ahead of me, past the gravel shoulder and the drainage ditch and the first wall of trees, a dog was chained to a tree with 2 newborn puppies, and she had looked at the back of a car and not understood why it was leaving. That was all I needed to know. I was wearing my pink dress, the one with the small buttons down the front that my grandmother had sent for my birthday. My good shoes. It didn't matter. I walked faster. Welcome to the channel. Before we go any further, before we find out whether Rover and her puppies survived the night, before we watch a little girl attempt something that most adults wouldn't dare, I want to ask you something. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much does this opening break your heart? Drop your number in the comments, and then stay with me because this story is just getting started. Her name was Stephanie. 7 years old, blonde hair tangled at the ends from a day of running, a pink dress already collecting dust at the hem. She was the kind of child who still believed, firmly and without apology, that a promise made to an animal counted just as much as a promise made to a person, maybe more, because animals couldn't accept your excuses. She had felt the coldness in her mother's heart for as long as she could remember. She'd grown up in its shadow, the way you grow up in the shadow of a tall building. You don't always notice it, but your skin is always just a little cool, the sunlight always stopping just short of where you're standing. She had learned, in the wordless way that children learn the most important things, not to expect warmth from that direction. But she had always had Rover, who slept at the foot of her bed when the storms came, who pressed her enormous, solid head into Stephanie's lap when she cried, who lay perfectly still while Stephanie braided her fur with clumsy 7-year-old fingers, who had allowed her to name the two puppies Bolt because one was fast as lightning, Bean because the other was small and round and dark as a coffee bean, even though they were technically her father's dogs, and her father had his own names for them, and none of that had mattered. The dog had been the one living thing in that house that loved Stephanie without asterisks. And now Rover was chained to a tree on the edge of a forest, with a storm pressing down from the northwest and two puppies who could not yet regulate their own body heat, and Stephanie's mother was home choosing what to make for dinner. Stephanie stepped off the gravel road and into the trees. The chain was visible before Rover was, a dull silver glint through the grey-brown trunks, then the shape of the dog herself, sitting very still, her puppies tucked under her chest, her ears moving like small radar dishes toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Stephanie stopped walking. She knew better than to rush toward a frightened dog. Her father had taught her that. You go slow, you let them decide. She crouched down in the dirt. "It's me," she said quietly. "I'm here." Rover's ears swiveled. Her body went rigid for one long second. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, her tail began to move, not the full, sweeping wag of a happy dog, but the careful, tentative flag of an animal that has just been betrayed and cannot quite afford to hope again yet. Stephanie crawled forward on her knees until she was close enough to reach out. She didn't reach. She just let Rover smell her hand, her wrist, the inside of her elbow, taking whatever time she needed. The puppy, Bolt, made a small sound against his mother's belly. "I'm not leaving," Stephanie whispered. "I promise I'm not leaving." The chain clinked softly against the bark as Rover shifted her weight. Above the tree line, the sky had gone the color of ash. The first breath of cold air moved through the pines like something alive. Somewhere behind her, on the main road, a truck rumbled past without slowing. Stephanie pulled her knees to her chest, tucked her dress around the puppies, and sat down in the dirt beside a chained dog at the edge of a dark forest as the storm rolled in. A 7-year-old girl with no plan, no phone, and no intention of going anywhere. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. The ground was harder than it looked. That was the first thing Stephanie noticed once she stopped moving, once the decision had been made and her knees had found the dirt, and the urgency of getting there had been replaced by the strange, suspended stillness of being there. The earth beneath the pine trees was dry and packed, threaded through with roots that pushed up like knuckles. She could feel them through her dress. She didn't shift away from them. Rover watched her with the careful attention of an animal recalibrating its understanding of the world. 1 moment ago, the world had contained a woman in heels who had snapped a chain around her neck and walked away without looking back. Now it contained this, a small, familiar shape in pink, breathing quietly, not reaching, not running, just staying. Rover's nostrils worked steadily. Her ears moved. Beneath her chest, the two puppies stirred, and she dropped her chin briefly to nose each one before raising her eyes again to Stephanie's face. Stephanie had stopped herself from crying, not out of toughness, she was 7, and toughness was not a thing she'd had reason to build yet, but because she understood, in the deep, instinctive way children sometimes understand things before they have words for them, that Rover needed her steady. A crying child was an upset thing, and an upset thing made frightened animals more frightened. Her father had told her that. You go calm so they can borrow your calm. She held on to that now the way she might hold a railing on a dark staircase. The sky through the pine canopy had gone the color of old pewter. Whatever light was left in the afternoon was thinning fast, stretched too far across too much cloud, and the temperature had dropped in the last 10 minutes with a decisiveness that felt personal. Stephanie could feel it on her bare forearms. She pulled her sleeves down. Bolt made a sound, a thin, mewling complaint that was barely more than breath, and pressed deeper into the warmth of his mother's underbelly. Bean was quieter, tucked so completely under Rover's foreleg that only the dark curve of his back was visible. They were 9 days old. 9 days old, and already the world had introduced them to cold ground, cold air, and the particular terror of their mother's heartbeat running too fast. Stephanie watched them and felt something shift inside her chest that she had no name for yet, but would carry the rest of her life. She thought about the morning. She thought about how Rover had been in the kitchen when she came downstairs for breakfast, the way she always was, lying against the cabinet near the warm spot where the dishwasher vented, her tail lifting in lazy acknowledgement when Stephanie appeared in the doorway. Normal, everything normal. And then her mother had said, "I need to run an errand. Come keep me company," in that smooth, ironed voice, and Stephanie had climbed into the back seat without question, because 7-year-olds do not yet know to question the ordinary shape of a trap. She had watched her mother thread a chain around this tree with the efficiency of a woman completing a chore. She had watched Rover's tail make that last small, uncertain sweep. She had watched the SUV pull away. And now she was here, on her knees in the dirt, and the chain was real and heavy and locked, and she had no key and no phone and no plan beyond the single, irreducible fact of her presence. She was here, she had not left, she would not leave. She reached out slowly, palm up, and let Rover make the decision. The dog lowered her head. Her cold nose pressed briefly, firmly, into Stephanie's palm, a contact so deliberate it felt like a signature. Then she exhaled, long and shuddering, and settled her chin back over the puppies as if something had been confirmed. The first drop of rain touched the back of Stephanie's neck. She did not move. There is a thing that children understand about loyalty that adults spend years trying to remember. It does not require a plan. It does not require resources or leverage or the certainty of a good outcome. It requires only the willingness to stay when everything in the world is telling you it's already over. Stephanie was 7 years old, in a pink dress, in a forest, in the first minutes of a storm. She had none of the things that could solve this. She had only herself, her weight, her warmth, her refusal to be one more thing that walked away. Sometimes that is exactly enough to change everything. The lesson in this chapter isn't complicated, but it's one that adults forget constantly. Bearing witness matters. Staying matters. Not every act of rescue begins with a plan. Some begin simply with a child who refuses to look away. If you've ever stayed when it was easier to leave, you already know what Stephanie knew kneeling in that dirt. Compassion isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a hand held out in the dark, and a promise made to someone who's been taught not to trust promises anymore. Walker noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. That was the thing about a house with a German shepherd in it. The silence was never complete. There was always something, the soft percussion of paws on hardwood, the low exhale of a large animal shifting its weight, the subtle awareness of a living presence that altered the air of a room the way a candle alters darkness. Not dramatic, just there, the way a heartbeat is just there, unnoticed until it isn't. He set his keys on the entry table and stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. He told himself it meant nothing. Dogs slept. The puppies were barely 10 days old and Rover was nursing, which meant she tired easily, which meant she was probably in the laundry room on the bed he'd folded out of an old moving blanket, and the puppies were pressed into her side, and everything was fine. He told himself this clearly and with intention, the way you tell yourself something when some quiet part of you has already started asking questions. He checked the laundry room first. The blanket was empty. The back door was latched from the inside, which meant she hadn't gotten out that way. He checked the mudroom, the space under the stairs where Rover sometimes retreated when the house felt loud, the corner of the living room behind the armchair. He moved faster with each empty room, his jaw tightening. By the time he came back to the kitchen, he was moving quickly enough that his shoulder caught the doorframe and he barely felt it. Lily was at the island, pouring a glass of sparkling water, dressed as if she'd just returned from somewhere important. She looked up when he came in, and her expression arranged itself into something that was almost concern. The shape of it was right, but the weight was wrong, the way a photograph of fire doesn't produce any heat. "Where are the dogs?" he said. She set down the bottle with a small, precise click. "They got out." He waited. "I don't know how. I went to check on them this afternoon, and the back gate was open." She lifted one shoulder in a half shrug that was perfectly calibrated, not dismissive enough to seem callous, not distressed enough to require follow-up questions. "I drove around the block twice. I didn't see them." Walker looked at her for a long moment. He had been married to this woman for 9 years, and in 9 years he had learned to read the geography of her face the way a sailor reads water. The surface could be perfectly still and still be telling you something urgent if you knew what to look for. There was something in the spacing of her words tonight, something measured, something that had been decided on before he walked through the door. "Rover doesn't push gates," he said. "She never has." Then maybe the latch was loose. Her eyes moved to her phone. Conversation concluded. He stood in his own kitchen and felt something cool and heavy settle in his chest. Not quite anger yet, not quite grief, but the compound emotion that lives between them when you understand that something has happened and you are not going to be told what it is. He had loved his wife once the way you love something you believe is solid. He had spent the last 2 years quietly renegotiating what solid meant as she became someone who moved through their shared life with increasing indifference to anything that inconvenienced her architecture. The dogs had been an inconvenience. He'd known that. He'd told himself it would smooth over. He went back through the house, picked up his jacket, and went out the front door without explaining where he was going. Outside, the rain had started, a light, mean drizzle that carried cold in it, the kind that soaks through fabric in minutes and sits against the skin like a reprimand. He stood on the front porch and looked at the street, the darkening sky, the tree line visible at the far end of the neighborhood where the road curved, and the houses thinned and the world became something less managed. He thought about Rover. He thought about the puppies, 9 days old, unable to hold their own warmth, dependent on their mother's body the way only the very new and the very helpless are dependent on anything. He thought about what it meant to be that vulnerable on a night that was turning this cold. Then he thought about Stephanie. His daughter had not come to the door when he arrived, had not called down from her room. The house had been silent in the way that contained 2 absences, not one, and he had been so focused on the dogs that he had not yet asked the question. He turned back toward the front door. Fear, when left unexamined, doesn't stay still, it spreads. Lily made a decision that evening not from cruelty alone, but from unchecked anxiety wearing the mask of practicality. She had decided the dogs were a problem before they were ever given the chance to be anything else. This is the quiet danger of letting someone else's discomfort become your household's verdict. What we refuse to examine, we tend to destroy. And sometimes, what we destroy cannot be put back. Here is what nobody tells you about German Shepherds. They are not simply large dogs with good instincts and a talent for obedience. They are, by any honest measure, one of the most emotionally complex animals that has ever chosen to share its life with a human being. The research on this is not new, and it is not soft. It is neurological, behavioral, longitudinal, conducted across decades by scientists who began their work as skeptics and finished it as something closer to believers. A German shepherd's brain processes social bonds through many of the same neural pathways that a human brain does. They read faces. They track emotional tone in voices with a precision that bypasses language entirely and goes straight to meaning. They remember, not in the vague, impressionistic way we once assumed animals remembered things, but with specificity, with context, with the particular texture of individual relationships stored and retrieved and felt. What this means, stated plainly, is that when Rover watched that silver SUV pull away from the tree line, she did not experience it as confusion. She experienced it as recognition. She knew the woman who had done this. She knew the smell of her, the sound of her footsteps, the specific cadence of her voice, had known them for 3 years, had mapped them into her understanding of the world as thoroughly as she had mapped Walker's hands or Stephanie's particular high-pitched laugh. She had offered that woman the same fundamental trust she offered everyone in her household, the daily, unremarkable trust of an animal that has been fed and sheltered, and has therefore concluded, reasonably, that the arrangement is mutual. That trust had been answered with a chain and a pine tree and a retreating engine. Dogs do not have a word for betrayal, but the body keeps its own record. Rover's cortisol levels, in the minutes after that SUV disappeared, would have spiked in a pattern indistinguishable from what stress researchers observe in grieving humans. Her heart rate elevated. Her breathing went shallow. She scanned the road for 20 minutes after the sound of the engine faded, her ears swiveling toward every vehicle that passed on the distant highway, performing the same recalibration over and over. Is this it? Is this the correction? Is this the part where the mistake gets fixed? Until the rain began and her attention was pulled back to the more immediate emergency of the 2 small bodies pressed against her. Because that was the other thing. The thing that made this not merely cruel but dangerous in the specific, clinical sense of the word. Puppies cannot regulate their own body temperature. This is not a marginal limitation. It is a biological absolute. In the first 3 weeks of life, a puppy's thermoregulatory system is essentially non-functional. Their bodies do not shiver effectively. They cannot generate sufficient metabolic heat. They are, in the most literal sense, dependent on an external heat source for survival, and that heat source, in every design nature intended, is their mother. A nursing mother dog maintains a body temperature her puppies can borrow. She positions herself around them with an instinctive precision that conserves warmth, redistributes it, monitors it. She is not merely feeding them. She is their climate. She is the controlled environment inside which their undeveloped systems are slowly learning to sustain themselves. Remove her from a warm house and chain her to a tree in dropping temperatures, and you have not simply relocated a dog. You have dismantled a life support system. Bolt and Bean were 10 days old. Their eyes were not yet fully open. Their legs could push but not yet carry them. They had no awareness of the rain beginning to darken the pine bark above them, no understanding of wind or exposure or the specific cruelty of wet cold against fur that has not yet grown to its full insulating depth. They knew warmth and hunger and the rhythm of their mother's breathing and nothing else. The world beyond that small radius did not yet exist for them. Which meant the world beyond that small radius was entirely capable of killing them without their awareness or resistance. A puppy separated from its mother in temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit can develop hypothermia within 2 hours. Their core temperature drops, their heart rate slows. They stop vocalizing not because they've calmed, but because vocalization requires energy they no longer have. They become still and slow in a way that looks, to an untrained eye, like sleep. It is not sleep. It is the body's last, quiet negotiation with its own limits. Lily had known none of this, or had known it and not cared, which amounts to the same outcome. The storm moving in from the northwest was carrying temperatures in the low 40s. The rain had already started. The pine tree offered shadow but not shelter, and a heavy chain allows for very little repositioning, very little ability for a nursing dog to find the angle that best blocks wind, best concentrates warmth, best does the intricate biological work she was designed to do. Stephanie was 10 days ahead of all this science. She didn't know the terminology. She didn't know the mechanism. She just knew that Bean had stopped making noise and that Bolt's tiny body felt different against her palm than it had 20 minutes earlier, lighter, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with weight, and that the rain was now coming in sideways through the trees, and that her dress was soaked through, and that she had made a promise. She pulled the puppies closer against her own body and held them there, offering the only warmth she had. The lesson here is not complicated, but it is one that deserves to be said clearly. Abandoning a nursing mother is not a disposal. It is a sentence for the mother, who is neurologically capable of experiencing the loss of her home and her people as genuine grief, and for the puppies, who will die of exposure before they are old enough to understand danger. Cruelty dressed as practicality is still cruelty, and indifference to suffering does not make the suffering less real. It only ensures that no one is there to stop it. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, she wasn't calling for help, wasn't crying, wasn't making any of the sounds a lost child makes when they want to be found. What he heard was smaller than that. A soft, repetitive sound, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere past the first wall of trees where the gravel shoulder dissolved into pine duff and root. He pushed through the undergrowth without slowing, the wet branches dragging across his jacket, the ground soft and giving under his boots in a way that told him the rain had been falling here longer than it had been falling in the neighborhood behind him. The flashlight on his phone found her dress first. Pink cotton, darkened with rain and smeared at the knees with the particular gray-brown of forest dirt. She was crouched low against the base of a pine tree, both arms wrapped around her own torso in a way that looked at first like she was cold. And she was cold. He could see that immediately, could see the fine trembling in her shoulders that she was working very hard not to show, but the posture wasn't about warmth. She was a container. She had made herself into a container for the two small bodies tucked against her stomach, inside the fold of her dress, which she had gathered up and around them like an improvised nest. Rover lay chained to the tree directly behind her. The chain was heavy and real and locked. Walker stopped walking. The flashlight beam moved from Stephanie to the chain, to Rover to the chain again, making the circuit twice. And in the space of those 2 seconds, something happened in his chest that was not quite any single emotion, but all of them simultaneously. Fear and fury and grief, and a specific, searing clarity that arrives only when a thing you have been half suspecting forces itself into full view and will not be looked away from. Steph, his voice came out lower than he intended. She looked up. Her face in the flashlight was pale and rain-wet, her hair plastered flat against her forehead, and her eyes held the particular expression of a child who has been waiting to be found and is now terrified of what being found will cost. Not afraid of him. He understood that immediately, and it mattered. She was afraid of what she was going to have to say. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "A while," she said. The trembling in her shoulders was more visible now. One of the puppies, Bolt, he could tell by the slightly darker muzzle, made a thin sound against her stomach, and she instinctively tightened her arms before she could stop herself. Walker crossed the distance between them and crouched down to her level. Up close, he could see that her lips had taken on a faint bluish cast at the edges and that her small hands, gripping the fabric of her dress, had gone the color of skim milk. She had been here long enough for her body to start making decisions about which parts of itself to keep warm. "Did Mom put this chain here?" he asked. The question sat in the air between them. Rover shifted behind Stephanie, the chain clinking against the bark, and the sound filled the silence in a way that was almost an answer in itself. Stephanie looked at him for a long moment. He watched her make the calculation, the one that children of difficult households learn to make early and make constantly, the equation that asks how much truth is safe and for whom, and he watched her decide, visibly decide, to abandon the calculation entirely. Her chin lifted slightly, her jaw set in a way that reminded him, painfully and precisely, of himself. "She put them here," Stephanie said. "I was in the back seat. I saw her do it. She had the chain before we left the house." A pause. "She told you they ran away." Walker didn't speak for a moment. He put his hand on the back of his daughter's head, briefly, firmly, the way you touch someone to confirm they are real and present and still here, and then he stood up and examined the chain. It was a logging chain, heavy gauge, padlocked at the link, and whoever had sourced it deliberately. This was not improvised. This was planned in advance, in a hardware store on an ordinary afternoon, with complete premeditation. He pulled his daughter to her feet with one arm and took the puppies from the fold of her dress with the other, tucking them both against his chest, inside his jacket, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 10 days learning the weight and temperature of 2 particular small animals. Rover stood immediately, her whole body oriented toward the puppies, the chain pulling taut. She looked at Walker with amber eyes that held, he thought, a dignified and devastating absence of surprise. He unzipped his jacket further and held it open so she could see the puppies were safe, that they were warm, that they were not going anywhere without her. "I'm coming back with bolt cutters," he told her. He said it the way he'd said it to Stephanie, directly, without softening, the way you speak to someone whose intelligence deserves the truth. 30 minutes. Do you understand me? I'm coming back." Rover held his gaze for a moment. Then she lowered herself back onto the pine duff, tucked her nose toward the space where the puppies had been, and waited. He turned to Stephanie. She was shivering openly now, the performance of steadiness finally abandoned, but she was standing straight and her eyes were dry, and she was looking at him the way children look at parents when they are deciding, in real time, whether that parent is someone they can afford to trust with the hardest things they know. "You did right," he said. It was not a complicated thing to say, but he meant it completely, and she needed to hear it completely, and so he said it without qualification and without softening and without immediately moving on to the next practical concern. He let it land. "You did exactly right." She nodded once. Then she slipped her cold hand into his, and they walked out of the trees together toward the lights of the neighborhood, and the rain came down around them, and behind them in the dark, the chain made a small sound against the bark as Rover shifted her weight and waited. What this chapter teaches is not about dogs. It's about what happens to truth in houses where honesty is inconvenient. Stephanie had watched her mother commit a deliberate act of cruelty, and her first instinct was to weigh the cost of telling her father, not because she doubted what she'd seen, but because she had learned, in the gradual way children learn the rules of difficult households, that truth has consequences. The relief on her face when Walker said "you did right" was not just a child being praised. It was a child being told, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that the world she was accurately seeing was the world that was actually there. Before we go any further, before we follow Walker back through those trees with bolt cutters in hand and 2 puppies tucked against his chest, I need to stop and say something directly to you. Lily knew what she was doing when she sourced that chain. She did not act in a moment of panic or poor judgment. She planned it the way you plan something you intend to finish, quietly in advance, without telling anyone, because you already know that if you tell anyone, they will try to stop you. She looked at a nursing mother dog and her 10-day-old puppies, and she made a calculation. The calculation was not, are these animals suffering? The calculation was, are these animals inconveniencing me? And the answer was yes, so she disposed of them. That is not a personality quirk. That is not a bad day. That is the kind of character that destroys families from the inside, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the slow, quiet, methodical way of someone who has decided that their comfort is the only variable that matters. If you believe that a mother who could do this doesn't deserve the title, if this story has already made something tighten in your chest, subscribe to this channel right now. Our team is working toward 1,000 subscribers this month because these stories need to be told, and they need to reach people who still believe compassion is worth fighting for. Don't scroll past. Don't be the person who watched and kept walking. Join our growing family, and let's keep going. The bolt cutters were in the garage, on the second shelf, behind the camping equipment Walker had not touched since the year Stephanie was born. He found them in under 2 minutes, which told him something about the kind of man he was, the kind who kept tools organized, who maintained things, who believed in being prepared for problems before they arrived. He had spent 9 years applying that philosophy to everything in his life except the most important one. He understood that now with a clarity that was almost physical, a pressure behind the sternum that had nothing to do with exertion. He was back at the tree in 24 minutes, he counted. Rover heard him coming before the flashlight found her and was already on her feet, her whole body forward and straining against the chain, when he pushed through the undergrowth. He didn't waste time. The bolt cutters found the padlock shackle on the second attempt, and the chain fell away from the tree with a sound like something releasing a breath it had been holding for hours. Rover stood absolutely still for one full second, processing the sudden absence of resistance the way a prisoner tests the ground outside a cell. And then she was moving, pressing into his legs briefly before wheeling back toward the road with her nose low and urgent, tracking the scent trail toward the puppies he had left with Stephanie at the tree line. He followed her out of the forest at a run. Stephanie had the puppies inside her jacket when he emerged onto the gravel shoulder. She had stopped shivering, which worried him more than the shivering had. He knew enough about cold exposure to know that the cessation of shivering was not always improvement, and he put his hand briefly to her cheek to check her color before he took the puppies and transferred them to Rover, who received them with a focused, thorough intensity that allowed for nothing else in the world. She circled once, lay down on the gravel in the beam of the flashlight, and the puppies found her immediately. They walked home through the rain. Walker carried Rover's retrieved collar and leash. Stephanie walked close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm. No one spoke. The neighborhood lights grew steadily brighter through the wet trees, and then they were on the sidewalk, and then they were on their own street, and then Walker saw the house and stopped. The side gate was closed, not just latched. He could see from 20 feet away that the padlock he kept on it for the pool enclosure had been moved to the dog-run gate, which was not where it lived and had never been where it lived. He stared at it for a moment, recalibrating, and then he tried the front door. Locked, his key worked. He pushed it open and found the interior lights on and Lily at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and the particular composed stillness of someone who has made several phone calls and is now waiting for their consequences to arrive. She looked at the dog. She looked at the puppies. She looked at Walker's face, and something moved across her expression, not regret, not shame, but the quick tactical assessment of someone who has arrived at a confrontation they prepared for and is deciding which prepared response to deploy. "I called animal control," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "There's a stray German shepherd in the area that attacked a neighbor's cat. I reported it an hour ago. They'll be here shortly." Walker set the bolt cutters down on the entry table. He did it slowly and deliberately, the way you set something down when you need both hands and a clear mind. "She's not a stray," he said, "and she didn't attack anything." "That's not what the report says." Lily lifted her wine glass. "I'd get her out of sight if I were you. Once it's in the system, it's difficult to undo." Rover had not moved past the entryway. She sat at Walker's heel with the puppies between her forelegs and her amber eyes on Lily, and she did not growl, did not bark, did not show a single tooth. She simply watched. With that quality she had of making a room understand, it was being accurately read. Stephanie stood behind her father with her hand wrapped in the fur at Rover's shoulder. She was still damp, still pale, still wearing the ruined pink dress. She looked at her mother across the kitchen with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but something quieter and more final. The look of a child completing a long, reluctant calculation and arriving at an answer she had hoped not to find. Toxic pride does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a padlock placed on a gate while the rain falls, in a phone call made not in anger but in cold strategy. What Lily did in that hour was not an outburst, it was a campaign. She had been inconvenienced, and she was methodically eliminating the source of the inconvenience, and she did not consider, even briefly, the 7-year-old in the pink dress who had spent 2 hours in a forest in the rain trying to undo what she had done. That is the definition of toxic pride, the complete and functional absence of anyone else's reality from your decision-making. Families do not fracture in single moments. They fracture along lines that have been scored quietly and repeatedly by exactly this. The wine glass made a small, precise sound when Lily set it down. That was the thing about Lily in conflict. She never raised her voice, never lost the thread of her composure, never gave you the satisfaction of a reaction that confirmed she understood the gravity of what she'd done. She fought the way a scalpel works, precise, bloodless, and designed to leave you wondering afterward whether anything had actually happened. Walker had spent 9 years learning to recognize this as a tactic. He was done letting it work. Call them back, he said. Tell them it was a mistake. I don't think it was a mistake. She folded her hands on the island countertop with the patience of someone chairing a board meeting. I think this household has an animal problem that you've refused to address, and I've addressed it. That's all. You chained a nursing mother to a tree in a rainstorm. He kept his voice level, but made no effort to keep the weight out of it. You took our daughter in the car while you did it. Stephanie was in the back seat, Lily. She watched the whole thing. Something moved very briefly across Lily's face. Not remorse, he was certain of that, but the recalculation of someone who has just discovered a variable they hadn't accounted for. Her eyes moved to Stephanie, standing at the edge of the kitchen in the ruined pink dress, and the look she gave their daughter was not cruel exactly, but was so thoroughly without softness that it amounted to the same thing. Stephanie, she said evenly, go upstairs and change. Stephanie didn't move. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel it pressing against the walls of the room, feel everyone in it deciding simultaneously how far this was going to go. Rover remained absolutely still at Walker's heel, her breathing steady, her eyes on Lily. The puppies were quiet now, exhausted and warm for the first time in hours, tucked against each other on the entry rug. Bean's small side rose and fell in the rapid, trusting rhythm of a creature that has decided, provisionally, that it is safe. I want the dogs out of this house tonight, Lily said. I've been patient about this. Patient? Walker repeated the word the way you repeat something to confirm you heard it correctly before you respond to it. You sourced a logging chain, you purchased a padlock, you planned this. I made a decision about my own home. Our home. He moved into the kitchen, not toward her but past her, deliberately occupying the space, and turned to face her from the other side of the island. And those are my dogs. I brought Rover home before we were married, which you know, and the puppies were born in this house, which you also know, and I need you to hear me say this clearly, they are staying. Lily looked at him for a long moment. He watched her decide something. The watch on her wrist caught the kitchen light when she straightened, and she pulled her shoulders back in the particular way she had when she was moving from negotiation into territory she'd already scouted. Then Stephanie and I will go to my mother's, she said. I'm not raising a child in a house full of animals. If the dogs stay, we leave tonight. That's not a threat, Walker. That's a choice I'm giving you. Her voice was so reasonable it was almost gentle, which was the most dangerous version of Lily there was. Your daughter or your dogs, take a moment if you need one. He had known somewhere in the structure of himself that the conversation was moving toward this. You don't find a logging chain on a gate and a fabricated animal control report and arrive anywhere else. This was always where they were going. He understood that now, standing in his own kitchen in wet boots with his daughter behind him and his dog at his feet and his wife watching him across a marble countertop, as if the answer to this question was something she was genuinely curious about. He looked at Stephanie. She was watching him with those eyes that missed nothing, her hand still resting lightly on Rover's back, and she looked very small and very tired and very certain, in the way that children are certain about fundamental things before life teaches them to hedge. You're using our daughter as leverage, he said. I'm telling you what our family requires. Stephanie is our family, Rover is our family. You don't get to decide which parts of this family are expendable because they inconvenience you. He heard his own voice and was surprised by its steadiness. Something had settled in him in the last 2 hours, out in the rain, with bolt cutters at the base of a pine tree, something that had been loose and unresolved for much longer than tonight. And I need you to understand that what you did today, the chain, the call to animal control, the lie about the gate, I'm not going to move past that. I don't know how to move past that. Lily's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, the almost imperceptible adjustment of someone who expected to win this exchange and is recalculating the probability in real time. You're being dramatic, she said. I'm being accurate. He turned to Stephanie. Go get in the shower, warm water, stay in until you stop feeling cold. I'll bring you dry clothes. He kept his voice level and practical and directed entirely at his daughter, because what Stephanie needed in this moment was not to watch her parents dismantle their marriage across a kitchen island. She needed to be warm and dry, and to know that someone in this house was thinking about her welfare as a priority rather than a bargaining chip. Stephanie looked at him, then she looked at her mother, then she looked at Rover, who held her gaze for a moment with those amber eyes before resting her chin gently on Stephanie's knee, a gesture so deliberate it was almost a sentence. Then Stephanie walked past both of them and up the stairs, and Walker listened to her footsteps overhead until he heard the bathroom door close and the water begin to run. He turned back to Lily. "We are not done," he said quietly, "but tonight isn't the place to finish it." What Walker faced in that kitchen was a question dressed as a choice, and there is an important distinction between those two things. A genuine choice offers two legitimate options. What Lily offered was an ultimatum built on the premise that love is a finite resource that must be rationed, that choosing to protect one vulnerable living thing means abandoning another. This is one of the core mechanisms of control in toxic relationships, the manufacturing of false scarcity. You cannot love me and love them. You cannot protect your values and protect your home. Real families are not built on that premise. They are built on the understanding that compassion is not a pie with limited slices. It expands, it includes, and the person who demands you shrink yours to match their absence of it is telling you something essential about who they are. It was Bean. Walker found her just after midnight. When he came downstairs to check on the dogs, the way he'd been checking every 40 minutes since putting Stephanie to bed, setting a quiet alarm, rising in the dark, padding down the stairs in socked feet to confirm that the small, warm fact of them was still true. Rover was in the corner of the laundry room on the moving blanket, and Bolt was pressed into her side, making the small, satisfied sounds of a puppy that has eaten recently and is processing the experience with great contentment. Bean was not making any sounds at all. She lay apart from the others by about 6 inches, not far, not dramatically separated, just slightly outside the orbit of her mother's warmth, the way a sleeping child sometimes rolls to the edge of a bed without waking. But she was not asleep. Her chest was moving, but barely, each breath so shallow it was more suggestion than fact, and when Walker picked her up and held her in his palm, he felt it immediately, the wrong temperature. Not cold exactly, but not warm enough. The particular lukewarm of something that has been losing heat steadily for long enough that it no longer remembers what warm felt like. He said her name. She didn't respond. He moved to the kitchen without running. Running would startle Rover, and a startled Rover was a complication he could not afford right now. But he moved with the compressed urgency of someone overriding the instinct to panic through sheer procedural focus. He had looked this up 3 weeks ago, when Rover was still visibly pregnant, and he had stayed up reading everything he could find about newborn puppy care. He had read about hypothermia, and he had taken notes in the margins of a notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer specifically because Lily had told him he was being obsessive, and he had decided to be obsessive anyway. He found the notebook. He turned on the oven light over the stove for warmth without heat. He found the clean towels on the second shelf and began the careful, deliberate work of warming Bean from the outside in, not with direct heat, never with direct heat on a chilled puppy, but with the slow transfer of body warmth through layered dry fabric, his hands working in gentle circular motions over her tiny ribcage, talking to her in a low, steady voice that was as much for his own regulation as for hers. He didn't hear Lily come in. He became aware of her the way you become aware of a draft, a slight change in the quality of the air, a peripheral stillness that didn't belong in a room where everything else had purpose. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in her silk robe, her arms folded, watching him. Her face in the low light was not unkind exactly, it was simply absent, the way a window is absent of warmth. You can see through it clearly, but it gives you nothing back. "Is it dying?" she asked. The question was delivered with the same neutral curiosity she might bring to a traffic report. Walker did not look up from Bean. "She's hypothermic," he said. "Her temperature dropped. Because you brought her back here instead of letting nature handle it." He continued the circular motion over Bean's sides. In his palm, something almost imperceptible was beginning to change, a fractional increase in resistance, a small tension returning to the muscles under his fingers, the body beginning to remember its own argument for continuation. He focused on that and only that. "Hand me the syringe from the third drawer," he said. Lily didn't move. He reached across himself with his free hand and found the drawer, found the syringe, found the glucose solution he'd prepared earlier and capped and set in the refrigerator because he had taken notes in a notebook, and he had been obsessive, and obsessive had turned out to be exactly right. He administered a small amount along Bean's gumline with the practiced care of someone who has read the instructions enough times to have absorbed them into muscle memory, then returned both hands to the warming work. Bean's next breath was slightly deeper than the one before it. He noticed, he didn't say anything, he just noted it and continued. Rover appeared in the doorway behind Lily, had padded in silently, as she moved when she was tracking something with full attention, and stopped when she reached Lily's position in the doorframe. For a moment the two of them occupied the same threshold, the woman in silk and the dog with her amber eyes, and Rover looked at what Walker was doing with Bean, and then looked at Lily with an expression that was, if you were paying attention, its own complete and sufficient verdict. Then she walked past Lily without acknowledgement and came to Walker's side and pressed her nose briefly against Bean's small body, confirming, cataloguing, deciding. Then she sat down beside him and waited with the focused patience of an animal that understands that some work requires stillness more than action. "You're going to do this every time one of them sneezes," Lily said from the doorway. Her voice had taken on the tone she used when she was framing a concern as practical observation. "This is your life now, middle-of-the-night emergencies, vet bills, a house that smells like dog. You understand that?" Walker looked up at her then. Just once, just briefly, over the small warm weight of the puppy in his hands and the dog at his knee, and the notebook with its careful handwritten margins. And he looked at his wife of 9 years, standing in the doorway of their kitchen, watching a puppy fight for its life and feeling, as best as he could read her, primarily inconvenienced by the scene. "Go back to bed, Lily," he said. She stood there a moment longer, then she turned and went. Bean's eyes opened at 2:47 in the morning. Not fully, just a sliver, just the barest acknowledgement of light and presence, but open. Walker felt it before he saw it, felt the change in her small body like a current returning to a wire, and he exhaled once completely and then picked up the notebook from the counter and wrote the time in the margin next to the recovery protocol because he was, in fact, obsessive, and obsessive had mattered tonight in a way that nothing else had. He sat on the laundry room floor until dawn with Bean in the warmth of his folded jacket and Rover's head heavy on his knee and Bolt snoring against his thigh. And outside the rain continued its slow work on the world, and inside the house above him Lily slept in clean sheets in an untroubled room, and the distance between those two facts felt, for the first time, like something he could accurately measure. Indifference to suffering is not neutrality, it is a position. When Lily stood in that doorway and watched a puppy struggling to survive and felt nothing that altered her posture, her voice, or her willingness to hand over a syringe, she was not failing to act, she was acting. She was demonstrating, with complete clarity, the precise limits of her empathy. We often wait for cruelty to announce itself dramatically. But its most honest form is quieter than that. It is the person in the doorway who watches and calculates and goes back to bed. Pay attention to how the people in your life respond when something small and helpless needs them. It will tell you everything about who they are when you need them. The officer arrived at 9:17 in the morning. Walker heard the truck before he saw it, the specific diesel idle of a municipal vehicle pulling to the curb with the unhurried confidence of official business. And he was at the front door before the knock came. Which meant he saw the officer's face before Lily could intercept it, before she could position herself in the entryway and begin the work of framing what he was about to walk into. That positioning mattered. Walker understood this the way you understand chess after you've already lost several games. The person who controls the opening controls the narrative. The officer was younger than Walker expected. Mid-30s, clipboard, the practiced neutral expression of someone who has learned to gather information before forming opinions. His name tag read Devereaux. He had a calm, methodical quality that Walker immediately respected and understood he would need to rely on. "Got a call yesterday evening," Devereaux said. "Report of an aggressive stray German shepherd unprovoked attack on a neighboring animal. You the resident?" "I am," Walker said, "and the dog in question is not a stray. She's been licensed to this address for 3 years. I have documentation." He had pulled the paperwork at 6 in the morning. Rover's registration, her vaccination records, the vet file going back to her first visit, the microchip registration with his name, and this address printed in clean black type. He had paper-clipped everything in order and left it on the entry table the way he left everything he needed, organized, accessible, prepared. The notebook approach applied to this too. He handed it to Devereaux before Lily reached the doorway. She appeared a moment later, dressed impeccably, her composure installed like a fresh coat of paint over whatever calculations were running beneath it. She had timed her entrance for after the initial exchange. Walker noted, close enough to intervene, but far enough back to let the officer form a first impression of a calm, reasonable household before she added her layer to it. "Officer," her voice carried exactly the right register of concerned citizen. "Thank you for coming. I want to be transparent. The dog is technically registered here, but there have been ongoing safety concerns that my husband has minimized. With a young child in the home, I felt I had a responsibility to make the call." Devereaux looked at the paperwork in his hand. Then he looked at Lily. Then he looked at Walker with the expression of a man who has walked into the middle of something and is taking his time locating all the edges of it. "The report mentioned an attack on a neighbor's cat," he said carefully. "Can you tell me the neighbor's name and address?" A brief pause, almost imperceptible unless you were watching for it. It was relayed to me secondhand. I don't have the name directly." "The incident date and time?" Another pause. "Yesterday afternoon." "Ma'am, I'll need a specific complainant to pursue an aggression report. A second-hand account doesn't give me enough to." "Then let me show you the dog," Lily said smoothly, pivoting without breaking stride the way she always pivoted, and Walker felt the familiar cold recognition of watching her redirect a conversation she was losing into a room where she had better footing. "I think once you see the size of the animal and the puppies in the house, you'll understand my concern, especially given there's a child here." Walker stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, just present. "The dog is in the laundry room with her 10-day-old puppies. She has never displayed aggression toward any person or animal in this household. My daughter has been handling the puppies since birth." As if on cue, and Walker would spend a long time afterward wondering whether some intelligence in Rover had understood the stakes of the morning, Stephanie appeared at the top of the stairs. She came down slowly, in clean clothes, her hair brushed, and she was carrying Bolt against her chest with the practiced, careful hold of a child who has been trusted with something fragile and takes that trust seriously. Bolt's round, dark head turned with sleepy curiosity toward the unfamiliar figure in the doorway. Devereaux looked at the puppy. Something shifted in his professional neutral expression, not much, just a degree or two in the direction of a human being rather than a municipal officer. He looked at Stephanie, then at Walker, then back at the clipboard. "How old?" he asked. 10 days, Walker said. "She nearly didn't make it through last night. Hypothermia." Lily made a small sound in the back of her throat that was meant to convey concerned skepticism and instead conveyed something she hadn't intended. Devereaux heard it. Walker saw him hear it, the slight refocusing of attention, the quiet recalibration of who in this room was telling him what. "I'm going to be honest with you," Devereaux said, and he said it to the room, to no one specifically, in the tone of a man who has done this long enough to know when a call is not what it was reported as. "I can't act on an aggression complaint without a named complainant and a specific incident. What I'm seeing here is a licensed, vaccinated animal with current documentation and a nursing litter. That's not a stray, and that's not an imminent public safety issue." He closed the clipboard. "If there's a genuine concern about animal behavior going forward, you can file a formal complaint at the office with your name attached to it. That's the process." He looked at Lily when he said your name attached to it. It was a brief look, measured, and it said several things that official language does not permit. Lily held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then she looked at her phone. Devereaux shook Walker's hand, told Stephanie the puppy was a good-looking dog, and left. The truck pulled away from the curb with the same unhurried diesel idle it had arrived with, and the street went quiet, and Walker closed the front door and stood in his own entryway with the paperwork still in his hand and his daughter on the stairs and his wife by the window and Rover's quiet presence at the end of the hall. And the house felt very still in the way that things feel still in the moment before a final decision gets made. Before we get to what happens next, I need to say something to you directly. Lily is counting on you to move on. She is counting on the scroll, the skip, the comfortable assumption that someone else will pay attention, someone else will share, someone else will make the noise. That is exactly how the disposable culture she represents continues, not because people approve of it, but because not enough people refuse to be silent about it. So let me ask you something. If you had been Walker this morning, if you had stood in that doorway with the documentation in your hand and the puppy in your daughter's arms, would you have stayed? Would you have stood up to a spouse to save a life? Like this video, share it, and drop the words "everyone deserves respect" in the comments right now so that Lily and everyone like her understands that the people watching are not scrolling past. Compassion wins, but only when enough people decide it's worth fighting for. Be one of those people. There is a particular kind of dishonesty that operates entirely within the technical boundaries of truth. The complaint filed without a name, the concern expressed without evidence, the alarm raised in the language of safety while serving the purpose of elimination. Lily did not lie to the officer in any single statement that could be caught and corrected. She simply arranged fragments in a pattern designed to produce a specific outcome. This is worth naming because most of us will never encounter cruelty that announces itself clearly. We will encounter it in the form of a reasonable voice and a strategic pause and a pivot executed so smoothly we almost miss what just happened. The ability to recognize this, to see the pattern beneath the language, is one of the most important things a person can develop. It is what Walker was doing with that paperwork at 6 in the morning. He wasn't just documenting a dog. He was preparing to tell the truth in a room where truth was going to need every advantage it could get. Lily left on a Thursday. Not dramatically, there was no door slamming, no tearful confrontation on the front lawn, no moment of operatic collapse that might have given the whole thing a shape that was easier to process afterward. She left the way she had always moved through the world, efficiently, with her affairs in order, having already made the arrangements before she announced them. 2 suitcases in the hallway when Walker came downstairs. A car service idling at the curb. Her lawyer's card on the kitchen counter, placed with the precise deliberateness of a period at the end of a sentence she had been composing for longer than Walker had realized. "I want the house on the market by spring," she said, not bitterly, just factually in the voice she used for logistics. Walker looked at the card, then at the suitcases, then at his wife of 9 years. Standing in the morning light in the entryway of the home they had shared through the accumulation of ordinary days and extraordinary disagreements, and the slow, grinding renegotiation of who they were each becoming. He looked at her for a long time, the way you look at something you are memorizing not out of longing, but out of the need to understand what you spent so long not seeing. "Okay," he said. She picked up her bag. She did not go upstairs to say goodbye to Stephanie, which Walker noted and filed in the place where he kept the evidence he hadn't wanted to collect. The door closed. The car pulled away. The street absorbed it all without comment, the way streets do. Upstairs, Stephanie slept through all of it. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. Quieter in some ways and louder in others, louder with the sounds that had always been in the house, but had been crowded out by the low-frequency tension of Lily's presence, the ambient electricity of a household walking carefully around a live current. Without it, the house expanded. Not physically, but in the way that rooms expand when the people in them are no longer performing themselves for an audience that won't be satisfied. Walker repainted Stephanie's room on a Saturday in October. She chose the color, a soft, particular green that she said looked like the inside of a forest, which he privately thought was exactly right. They painted together, badly, with too much on the rollers and not enough attention to the edges, and Rover supervised from the doorway with the expression of an animal profoundly skeptical of the entire enterprise. Bolt and Bean had discovered by this point that paint trays, if left unattended, were accessible and interesting, which resulted in a set of small green paw prints across the drop cloth that Walker photographed before cleaning up, because he understood, in the way you understand things that matter, that these were the exact details that become important later. He did not rush anything. He did not perform recovery. He got up every morning and made Stephanie's breakfast and drove her to school and came home and worked and checked on the dogs, and some evenings he sat on the laundry room floor for no particular reason and let Rover put her head on his knee and just stayed there, in the quiet, in the uncomplicated warmth of an animal that had never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. Stephanie, for her part, was fine in the complicated way that children are fine, which is to say she carried the weight of what had happened in ways she didn't always have language for, but she carried it upright, and she asked questions when she had them, and she cried twice that Walker knew about, and possibly more times that he didn't, and she never once, in all of it, stopped talking to Rover with the full confidence of someone addressing a peer who both understood and cared. She named Bean officially on a Friday evening in November, sitting on the kitchen floor with both puppies in her lap, and a gravity to the occasion that Walker recognized as ceremonial. Bean became Brave. Bolt stayed Bolt, because Bolt, Stephanie explained seriously, already knew exactly who he was. Walker didn't argue with the logic. On a cold evening in December, Walker drove past the old house on his way home from an errand. He didn't plan to. The route just took him by it. The house Lily had kept in the settlement, the one with the cream-colored exterior and the manicured front garden and the windows that had always been slightly too clean, as if the light were being filtered before it was permitted entry. The lights were on. Through the front window he could see the clean lines of the living room, the white furniture, the arranged objects, the curated absence of disorder. It looked exactly as it always had. Pristine, ordered, precise. He sat at the stop sign for a moment and looked at it. Then Rover pushed her nose between the front seats from the back and pressed it briefly, firmly, against his jaw, and he laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of it, and reached back to push her gently away, and she retreated with the dignity of a dog who has made her point and considers the matter concluded. He drove home. Stephanie was at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in, her tongue between her teeth, in the expression of focused effort she'd had since she was 3. Bolt was asleep under her chair. Brave was attempting to scale the back of the sofa with a determination that far exceeded her current capabilities. The house smelled like the dinner Walker had left in the slow cooker, and the windows were fogged slightly at the edges from the warmth inside against the cold outside, and Rover met him at the door the way she always did, not frantically, not performatively, just present, just glad, just there. He stood in his entryway and took a full breath. There is a particular kind of clarity that only arrives after a long period of compromise, not the dramatic clarity of a single revelatory moment, but the quiet, cumulative clarity of a life that has been slowly recalibrated toward honesty. Walker had not chosen this version of his life over the previous one. The previous one had made the choice for him, had revealed itself as something that could only be maintained by the ongoing suppression of everything he actually valued. What remained, once the suppression was no longer required, was simply this: a kitchen with homework in it, 2 puppies conducting chaotic experiments in the living room, a dog who had been chained to a tree and had survived it, and a daughter who had knelt in forest dirt in a pink dress and made a promise she kept. He hung up his coat. He went to the kitchen and stood behind Stephanie and looked at her homework and told her the 3rd answer was wrong, and she told him she knew and was getting there, and Rover came and sat between them with her warm, solid weight and her amber eyes and her complete and uncomplicated presence. This was what remained. This was, it turned out, everything. The ending of this story is not complicated, but it deserves to be said plainly. You cannot build a life of meaning with people who have decided that living things are disposable. Not because they are incapable of change, perhaps they are, perhaps they aren't, but because the cost of waiting to find out is paid entirely by you in the currency of your own slow diminishment. Lily stands in a clean, quiet house tonight, and perhaps she believes she won. But winning that way, with a padlock and a false report and a lawyer's card on a counter, is just losing with better furniture. The life Walker has now is not a consolation prize. It is the destination he would have found years earlier if he had listened sooner to what the evidence was telling him. Surround yourself with people whose empathy is real. Choose the ones who stay in the rain, the ones who keep their promises to animals and children and anyone else who needs them to stay. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing.